You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Please join us at the Open Door. We discuss solidarity, subsidiarity, economic democracy, and nonviolence in light of Catholic social teaching. We explore how to move from discussion to political change. Culture and politics, to be sure, are interwoven, so we care deeply about education and the arts. Our questions often lead us to report on the projects and promise of the American Solidarity Party.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelist Mario Ramos-Reyes, and we think Valerie Niemeyer waiting in the wings, depending on her kids. Today, we continue our discussion of education. We'll focus on preparing and supporting Catholic school teachers. Our welcome guest is Deacon Omar Gutiérrez, the president and executive director of the Evangelium Institute. An expert on Catholic social teaching, he has been published in many print and online periodicals, has authored several books on the subject, and has his own podcast on Discerning Hearts. Most importantly, Deacon Gutiérrez is happily married to Miriam, and they are very blessed by their 5 children. Let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Deacon Omar, could you tell us about your background and work in the area of Catholic social teaching? How did you come to teach and write about this topic, which we here at the Open Door care so very much about?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to meet you and be with you. What I usually sort of say to folks is I'm a first-generation American. My parents were from Latin America. My father from the Dominican Republic. My mother from Costa Rica. They met in Michigan, obviously. They had a difficult marriage, in part because being Dominican, my father was very dark-skinned, he was black, and my mother was very light-skinned. And so they experienced a good deal of racism in the United States back in the 1960s. In fact, the first priest they went to marry them refused to do so because they were mixed race. So that was part of the difficulty in the marriage. But the other difficulty was that my dad was essentially a communist, socialist, atheist. Fidel Castro was his hero, whereas my mom was very much a devout Latina Catholic. And so growing up, trying to figure out, my brothers and I, trying to figure out first what it meant to be an American. What did that look like? How could we fit in? But also not fit in too much to a certain degree. But then also for each of us, what did it mean to be Christian? What did it mean to be Catholic? Was that something we were going to pursue ourselves in our own lives? And for me, the intersection, and I think I can say this for my brothers as well, the intersection between faith and politics and economics and culture and education and all those things became just sort of part of the ethos, the air that we breathed in my house. So that when I was drawn towards theology and then discovered Catholic social teaching in college, I found an aspect of the church's teaching that really spoke to me and drew my attention and drew my interest. And so I've been pursuing it essentially ever since then.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Mario, what next?
So interesting background. What is the, I don't know if you have an institute, Evangelium Institute. What is that institute all about?
Yeah, so I founded it a few years ago here in the Archdiocese of Omaha, which is a relatively smaller diocese, but we have, I think it's still true, the third highest per capita number of schools per Catholics in the country. So we have a great many Catholic schools here. And Archbishop George Lucas, who's the Archbishop here since 2009, he, in response to the desires of parents and grandparents, wanted to do something for formation for Catholic school teachers. They wanted to make sure that the teachers who were teaching the children had some sense of the faith life, not just intellectually, but also from the heart. So he had brought in an organization to help do that, and in 2019, I co-founded the Evangelium Institute to help provide that formation to these Catholic school teachers here in the Archdiocese of Omaha. The results we've shown, I think, have demonstrated the importance of this work in the lives of the teachers, for the families that send their kids to Catholic schools, and really just for the larger church.
So the main concern of the Institute is teaching about Catholic social teaching. Am I correct on that?
Not explicitly Catholic social teaching, no. Although we do teach it. So we've been doing this for a number of years. We have, let's say we'll take a year and we'll go through a section of the Catechism, or we'll go through a Gospel. So this year that we're ending right now, we just finished the Gospel of St. John with an emphasis on the Eucharist. And we looked at social science about what's keeping kids Catholic, what's not keeping kids Catholic, why are kids leaving, that sort of thing. And then so we provided Bible studies for the teachers as well, so they can help foster a community of faith, essentially, within their schools. So we do touch on Catholic social teaching, but it's not exclusive. One thing, of course, I always like to emphasize to them, though, is that their fulfilling of this ministry as a teacher is an aspect of the Church's social teaching. They're living it out by providing services to these families.
Okay, thank you.
Deacon Omar, I've been for some time, courtesy of the late Father Jim Shaw, S.J., a fan of G.K. Chesterton, and also his less than comical sidekick, Hilaire Belloc. And once upon a time in the publication Gilbert, there was a fellow there who was offering pictures, good pictures, intriguing the way he put them together. And one of them was of Belloc. And it had Belloc with a kind of a smile on his not always smiling face, and drinking a small glass of wine. But the legend was, now the faith is not taught. It is breathed in and inhabited. And I've always thought to myself as a teacher, but it is taught. But then also as a teacher, I thought it would be better off if it were breathed in and inhabited. What do you think about this legend of the legendary Hilaire Belloc?
Yeah, so I like you, I agree and disagree with that to a certain degree. I mean, so it is taught, right? So one of the things I've realized in working with some of these teachers, you don't know what you don't know. And so they, when they're exposed to the Church's teaching on any number of various subjects. So just a quick story. I was teaching at a rural school. This was a number of years ago. And, oftentimes, just being real here, you'll have the coaches at the back of the room with their laptops up and they're doing work, or they're working on plays, or you can see them texting each other about something. Who knows, right? So you never know what they're listening to. if they're still holding some sort of part of their brain onto you. Well, after the talk was over, which was that on the sacraments, specifically on the sacrament of reconciliation, confession, one of the coaches came up and he said, I've never heard confession explained that way. And I think I'm ready to go back. And then another coach came up to me afterwards, and he was a convert from Lutheranism, converted to the faith because of his wife. He said, I've never heard the confession explained that way. I think I'll go. So information, if you're familiar at all with the thresholds of conversion for someone, there has to be some sort of basic level of trust for conversion to be able to happen down the road. And for many people, information, truth, helps found and create some of the trust that's necessary for conversion. So faith can be taught. I've seen it. However, I think Belloc is also correct in that it has to be lived. It has to be breathed in. It's one thing to know it intellectually. It's another thing to live it. I think the entire Christian life is a process of moving from the head to the heart. And I don't know if this is apocryphal, but it's associated with Chesterton, at least in my memory, that the longest or hardest journey of a person to move from the head to the heart. The idea that I can know something, but unless I'm living it deeply and interiorly, then I'm not truly inhabiting that. I'm not truly allowing it to transform myself, which is what the Church's teaching is designed to do. So the living it and inhabiting it. As a deacon, I've worked with RCIA or OCIA candidates for a number of years. And if there's ever a teaching that's difficult for someone, I tell them, like, it's one thing to know the facts. You might just have to live it for a while. Just try living it. And then you'll find that it fits. And it's what you've been waiting for, but you won't know that until you actually start living it.
For years now, Mario has been trying to get me to move from my head to my heart. And I always tell him, look, Mario, it's a two-way street. And that has led to important discussions over the years. But your turn, Mario.
So, according to what you said, what would be the challenges then in church teaching, in evangelization? According to what is happening in the culture?
Yeah, so at least what the various studies say, on one level, there is this this broader sense that I can choose to be a rational person who bases my life on reason and logic, or I could be a religious person. A lot of Americans think that's the choice. Maybe it's a larger Western problem, but the average age of Catholics who leave the church, according to a CARA study that came out in 2016, is 13 years old. And 13 years old means they're in middle school. Their brains are starting to develop such that they can think rationally and start questioning things. And that early on, they start to think, no, it's all fairy tales. There's nothing real about it. The Gospels are not historically based. So the first biggest challenge is to try to convince folks that there is some sort of intellectual heft to the faith. If I may, I remember a number of years ago, I was teaching at a school. I had a very good relationship at the school with the teachers. I was there for 2-3 years. There was a young man amongst the teachers who paid attention, but I didn't quite know if he was following. By year 2, he started loosening up. By year 3, he would come after the session every once in a while to ask me very pointed questions. And then at the end of that 3rd year, he came up to me and said, "Hey, I just want to let you know that I'm moving on. My wife and I just had our 2nd kid. I need to make a little bit more money. I'm going to be working at a high school." And he said, I was going to go work at a public school, but because of these sessions, I really want to teach at a Catholic school. because I've come to realize how important my faith is to me. Now, I just ran into him actually a few months ago, and he's still teaching at a Catholic school, and he still remembers those sessions. But I bring it up because for him, and this is what he said, I'd never heard the faith presented in such an organized way. The idea that there's this inherent sort of a thread of truth that goes through the faith that I can actually latch onto. And he was a science teacher, I can latch onto as an intellectual person. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two, I think, is this lack of trust. Part of it is the intellectual thing, but I think lack of trust in terms of the relevancy of the church to the pains and sufferings and ills that exist in our time. I think that opening line of Gaudium et Spes, right, the joys and hopes and fears, etc., of the world, or the joys and hopes and fears of the church, is an attempt to address that very challenge. That the church cares, the church is present, the church desires to meet folks in their pain in order to bring them closer to Christ, who will give them ultimate radical freedom.
But when you explain, I think you do very well. It seems to me you are explaining from someone who is in the church, and you are directing to people who are participated in a school of the church. So that is very reasonable. But what about someone who is not teaching in an institution of the church, is in a public school, and yet that person needs to announce the gospel? How would you say? I think it's more challenging because you don't have a captive audience there, rather than the opposite. So how would you go about and approach that situation?
Yeah, so I just recently saw, the first thing that comes to mind is I recently saw something. I'm trying to remember what the context was, but it was a woman who had started to proclaim the gospel in her workplace, and this was a secular setting. And what she said was the key was that when I think the situation was the company started to lose money and people were being laid off and there was all sorts of turmoil, she maintained a kind of level of peace. And it was her witness of peace that gave the other coworkers a sense of wanting to get to know her better. What is it that gives her peace? It wasn't necessarily something that she had proclaimed. She certainly, she wore a cross around her neck and that sort of thing. But it was the witness of peace that drew people to her. And then her coworkers felt comfortable beginning with a conversation about faith. Because I think in the secular world, and some of our public school teachers who now teach at Catholic schools, so we've had this exodus, if you will, of a number of public school teachers who are now teaching Catholic schools here in the local area. Their desire to be able to share their faith has been one of their deepest reasons for coming to the Catholic school. And the reason for that is because in the secular system, in the public school, sharing your faith is sometimes considered an affront, right? As a kind of challenge to somebody else, as almost judgment of them. And so one has to be very careful then how one does that. This example of this young lady whose story I just heard this last week is one where through her witness of, let's say, kindness or peace or love, of accompaniment with her coworkers, through that witness of life, she was able to proclaim the gospel in a way that they could hear, because faith and religion is so foreign to so many.
Jim?
I thought you might have more to say, Mario. All right. I always have more to say. That's a problem. My wife says it's one of many problems. I appreciate your anecdotes, and let me share one with you. Mario and I we're both members of what we like to call the wave of the future. Right now, right now it's only a minor tributary. On some
I've
days,
been looking for you guys all my life.
and some days it seems to be a rivulet, as opposed to a minor uh, uh, tributary. Well, at any rate, it's the American Solidarity Party. And one of my 324 pet peeves as a member of the American Solidarity Party is that there are all sorts of real Catholic intellectuals, public intellectuals, who, I think are open to our efforts, are loath to get involved. And I think that's a shame. But at any rate, I doubt if any of them are tuning into us. But what I wanted to really present in this anecdote is once upon a time, had a discussion with a young woman who was very hesitant to say anything in public, not so much about her faith, but even about the party. And I went on at some length, which I'm sometimes given to doing, about how our party is intellectually very well grounded, and that I really didn't see why people are so hesitant. And she became so hesitant to pursue this discussion that she signed off. That was the end of the discussion. However, it seems to me that we have, and we've had some recent guests on the show, we have the intellectual resources to just be very sharp in the public forum. I think, for example, of somebody who's well known, somebody like Robert George, we don't have to be hesitant. And we ought to, I think, sometimes be much more aggressive. I have an ongoing conversation with a sometimes friend, one-time mentor, now, yes, only a friend, colleague in the Catholic Worker. But he's no longer a Catholic, right? And what happened really to him is, I think he drifted into a kind of evolutionary naturalism. And we were discussing recent protests, the current wave of protests. And he, in essence, looked at them wholly in terms of their likely effectiveness or not effectiveness, nothing more than that. And he thought the opposition, for the most part, to the position of the protesters, which is more than one position, of course, was based on a kind of stupidity. And so I said to him, look, as an evolutionary naturalist, to what do you attribute stupidity? In a way, this is the problem of evil for evolutionary naturalists. And then I pushed a little farther. I said, and is it really wrong to make people stupid? After all, that's what propaganda from both the left and the right is all about, making people stupid. Well, this is by way of email, and it's safer that way, of course. But he hasn't responded yet. And here, I guess what I'm getting at with this anecdote is that if you push our culture despisers a little bit harder than they're usually pushed, I don't think they have much to stand on. I don't think that they can give a justification for the discourse that they present. And I would like Catholics, and certainly Catholic kids, coming up and their teachers to be, I don't want to use that word, empowered. I want them to be emboldened. Any thoughts on my rant? And if not, Mario will have his own rant. We sometimes have a duel of the ranters here. Valerie is usually around to prevent that sort of self-indulgence. So you're going to have to play that role.
No, I sympathize very much with the desire for Catholics in general to be emboldened and to speak truth that's uncomfortable. I've talked before with some about the courage to be politically homeless, to abandon.
There's no need to be politically homeless. Pardon my interruption. All right, it was a minor interruption. Go ahead.
Right. Because they can't conceive of the political conversation outside of the binary that sort of dominates the conversation. And so I totally sympathize with that desire for Catholics to be emboldened to speak truth. My sense of, and I was just thinking about that this morning, my sense of where most teachers, because that's whom I'm dealing with mostly, are at, is they are oftentimes moms as well as teachers who are attempting to get through the curriculum that they're required to get through by the state, required to get through by the church, and in the meantime fit the rest of their lives into the day that they have before them while dealing with all the other things that happen in life in general. And more often than not, their deep desire is to be heard and to be encouraged. Now, this doesn't mean that we never challenge them, or we don't call them to more, or we don't try to inspire them to the greater. But if their formation is such that they can't conceive of what the greater looks like, or if the greater seems totally out of reach for them because of where they're at, then it comes off as challenge, as criticism, as judgment, instead of as encouragement. That's a challenge for me and for my instructors to try to walk with them, meet them where they're at. And sometimes in the same school, you'll have someone who wants the more, who will eat everything up and wants to hear more about what we're talking about, and the teacher who doesn't pray. And we've done surveys. We just finished one up at the end of this year with the teachers who say, I seldom pray. I pray maybe once a week. I never pray. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
There are so many different people that we have to reach in so many different places and by way of so many different approaches. Now, Mario, you can see, is thinking this over. That's what he does. I mean, he thinks things over. That's his problem. He thinks things over. Go ahead, Mario.
What I think is that Catholics have forgotten the intellectual tradition of the church. And I include there priests and bishops as well. In other words, because we don't have an awareness of that rich tradition, we just let the culture run their own claims. And that happened with many teachers, Catholic teachers. And they don't know exactly what to teach about certain issues. And I think I attribute that the United States never has been a Catholic country, has been a different type of country, Protestant. We can go on and discuss about that. We don't have this background. And so sometimes we try to fit into a culture which is foreign to us. That doesn't happen with other Latin American countries, which originally were Catholic countries. Now, they have their own problems. I understand that. And today, perhaps, we are almost the same after this secularization which is happening. But putting this aside, I'm interested in your take on Catholic social teaching. What is Catholic social teaching, and where these the principles, or what we may call the epistemological status of Catholic social teaching? What type of theology or is that a theology, or is just a public policy?
Yeah. The Catholic social teaching is in the Catechism. It's in the section of moral theology. You can find it in the discussion of the commandments, right? So it is its own part of Catholic theology. It has principles. The compendium of the social doctrine of the Church is good enough to lay some of those out, as well as some of the values, which when I talk to folks about Catholic social teaching, I tend to focus more on, because I agree with everything you said. I think we've forgotten the Catholic intellectual tradition so fundamentally that even the baseline values that Pope John the 23rd talks about in Mater Magistram Pacem in Terris, truth, freedom, justice, and love, right? Those four values are not understood in the same way that the Church understands them and the way the secular culture understands them. So the possibility of knowing truth. I mean, so John Paul II with Fides et Ratio had to explain, there's truth, we can know it. You have to get on board with that. Freedom, and we could go all day about the misunderstanding of authentic freedom in Western culture. Justice, we talk about social justice, and we should talk about social justice, but if you have a misunderstanding of what justice is, or if you never talk about what it is, from a classical philosophical point of view or any other, then you're going to miss out what social justice is. And then of course love, which is, I think, the great contribution of Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate, and in God is Love, and in the others, that social justice only gives you so far. The way I sort of put it is, social justice is the bare minimum. We're called not to create a kingdom of justice, but a kingdom of love, right? So if we're directed toward the love, all aspects of truth, freedom, and justice will be addressed. So the status of Catholic social teaching, the epistemological status here in the United States, in the West, with those, if anybody knows or has heard of it, they usually associate it with social justice, and then they usually have their sort of hangers, if you will, their intellectual hangers, in which they just they've compartmentalized it over here. It's a left issue, or it's a right issue, or it's a church issue, or it's the bishop's issue, but it doesn't really affect me and can't really affect me because I already know what I want to know about public policy. And that's, your last statement made me laugh, because when I talk to people about the Church of Social Teaching, more often than not, the only exposure they've received to it is in reference to public policy. They don't know the principles. They don't know how to apply the principles. They don't know what the principles look like in their lives. And then last thing I'll say is, you asked whether it's a theology or not. It is a theology. There is an intellectual thing to know, and I think it's important, and I love that. However, one of the things I've been focusing on more so in the last few years, I gave a retreat out in Richmond, Virginia on this last summer, is on the spiritual aspect of it. I think, the head to the heart, I think the social teaching provides us with the parameters, the principles by which we can respond to the Lord's movements in our hearts. So it has to be rooted in the caritas, in the love, the relationship with Christ, that spiritual reality. The intellectual aspects of the theology help us know how to respond through that discernment, but it has to start there with that relationship with Christ. Otherwise, I would argue we're just talking about a baptized humanitarianism.
Mario, does Deacon Omar remind you of Larry Chapp?
Yeah, well, perhaps he need to move to a farm now.
I'd be open to that. Actually, we had Larry Chapp was just out here a couple of weeks ago. I met him for the first time a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, just yesterday I emailed him congratulating about one of his articles. So yes, he resembles Larry in his view about Catholic social teaching. So, but I have a concern, and I think it's reasonable concern, is that when we Catholic talk about Catholic social teaching, and we announce these beautiful principles, solidarity, love, charity, everything else, that is good. But then we run into issues when we try to implement those principles or value, if you will, into public policy. And there, I think, is where the disagreement and the disappointment begins. Which one is the position, if you will, of Catholic social teaching in a particular issue? And so, and I understand there are more than one, but generally, we have this issue. In other words, we don't go into the detail. Because if you do, then the fight begins. And so that is a reason I think we don't have, at least we see that in the American Solidarity Party, a party which can propose this principle as such, because it seems that we are still not able to move from principle to what we may call the real life or the concrete policy. And I think this is an issue, not only in the United States, everywhere. And so we can start here talking about those all day long, but yet whether what is the just salary, what is the, I don't know, the right level of I don't know, of help from the state. And so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I was nodding because I know exactly that tension, that reality. One of the things I like to do. So just to give you an example, for instance, years ago, the USCCB was, and I'm not trying to knock them, but they were advocating in a press release for increase in national minimum wage hike.
Okay?
Right. All right, so it's a specific public policy issue, and then they referenced the principle of the Church's teaching on a just wage. Okay? Except that minimum wage and just wage are not synonymous. Right? They're not, terms that you can just sort of look at. Okay, that's problem number one. Problem number two is they then reference two studies arguing that raising the national minimum wage would help the poor in these various ways. The first study was put together by an organization, the board members of which were all the heads of unions and Democratic Party leaders. Okay? All people who have an incentive towards coming towards a specific conclusion. And then when you dig down into the study's details, you find out that there were missing references, where'd they get this number? Some of the numbers didn't quite make it right. The second study, they cited, was an actual economic study from a fellow in Austria who was working on the American system. Very long, all the math was there. All the maths were there. At the very end of the study, he says that raising the national minimum wage would be the least efficient way of helping the poor. A better policy would be X, Y, and Z. So these are the two studies the USCCB, again, you guys know this, right? These are people who work for the USCCB, not exactly, there's no bishop sitting down and actually working this stuff out, probably. So my sense is exactly that there is this tension between, we have these principles, and when you get into the nitty gritty, you actually do have to get into the nitty gritty and look at the studies as an objective observer instead of trying to move the football in a particular direction. And that's where the fights begin. I think that's where we should have the discussions, and we should be honest, right? With St. Augustine's famous line about in all things, in essentials, unity, and in non-essentials, diversity, in all things, charity. You were going to ask something. Go ahead.
What you're saying, I think, is very good. If you remember Gaudium Spes, when the document talk about the autonomy of temporal affairs, which means in this concrete case, how autonomous is economy or economics, and to what extent we can see the law of supply and demand, or whatever rules guide economics. So we can look at that. And so I'm a pastor, I'm not an expert on that, and I will trust to that particular school of economics. Yet there are more than one school. Now, that is the issue. We need to acknowledge that. And sometimes I'm asked, well, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? And I'm saying, well, the principle of the Catholic social teaching is this. However, how to go about and apply depend on how we understand economics in that particular situation. And there are more than one view, and both views may be respectful. And we need to be aware of that. There is no just a rigid way of applying the principle from the principle to the concrete. Otherwise, we need to long for monarchy or something like that. And this is a democracy. So perhaps we didn't, incorporate this view. And one of I'm going to say something controversial to some people. One of the best lines that Jacques Maritain, the Catholic philosopher, claimed was, we need to start from the starting point, which he called pluralism. Now, I know that he doesn't say, I'm going to start from unity. No, from pluralism. Well, people say, well, he's a relativist and all that. No, what he's is trying to say, acknowledge something is happening in our contemporary society. Whether they don't like it, we don't like it, but that's a fact. And we don't acknowledge that, then we move into integralist position, which I think has problem of their own. That's my rant for today. I'm sorry.
I like it. We should do this more often. I like your rants. This is great.
We're very sorry that Valerie couldn't join us today, but I want to move to a question that she takes very much to heart, and I'm going to use her exact language. She says, we've heard it said that the church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum of saints. We've all had occasion to be disappointed, if not scandalized, by poor leadership in the church and in Catholic schools. Do you have any suggestions based on your experiences for how to respond or not to respond in such situations?
Leave it to Valerie to ask such a question. Yeah. In my experience in walking with folks who have been deeply wounded by the church, what I've done, I guess I can just speak to what I've done, is to acknowledge their pain and to recognize. So with Catholics, so many of us feel like we're not allowed to be angry at persons in the church, at a priest or a teacher or somebody. And so to acknowledge that it's okay, that the anger, the pain, the suffering is real and it's okay. And they shouldn't feel guilty for feeling what they're feeling. And then beyond that, just to listen and walk with them, and to pray with them. So after acknowledging, helping them understand it's okay to feel what they're feeling, to listen, and then to be intentional in praying with the person, asking for healing. So it's one thing to acknowledge that the feelings are real, and that they're important and they reflect a reality and a truth. But we also want to recognize we don't want to leave somebody there because anger and pain, that's not what the Lord wants for us. So to be intentional about praying in such a way with the person, and I'm thinking of a specific situation right now where you acknowledge the pain, but you're calling upon the Holy Spirit or Our Lady or the Father, whatever's appropriate for the situation, to help that person heal from that pain, not forget, but heal from that pain so that they can better consider themselves a member of the church. The pain is a symptom of their feeling disunited from the church. And they need to feel part of her again.
Connect with the person.
Amen.
Mario?
So, how can anyone, regular folks, can help the good work of Evangelium Institute?
Oh, certainly we need your prayers. I mean, that's the most important thing. This is hard work. It's joyful work in many ways. A few weeks ago, I was with some teachers who serve some economically challenged parts of the city, and I was teaching them on the Last Supper in John's Gospel and on Eucharistic miracles from Argentina, and I mean, they just absolutely loved it. So it was a fruitful discussion. It was a joyful discussion. And so it's a joyful work. It's also just very hard because, there's sometimes at the end of the day, everybody's tired, all the things. So we need your prayers. But if you go to our website, eicatholic.org, eicatholic.org, you can look at the various things we do. And we don't just work with teachers. We also work with the candidates for the permanent diaconate. We provide some formation for them. We do a series for teens. We help out with the Director of Religious Education and Catechists here in the Archdiocese. We're kind of the big umbrella sort of mission is on catechetical formation for adults and young adults. I'm here at the John Paul II Newman Center, which is the Newman Center that serves the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And so we provide classes for the college students who are going to a secular university, but they deeply want and desire more formation in the faith. So this year, I just finished up a whole year-long course, 21 sessions on Catholic moral theology, which the students love. So help us in any way you can by visiting our website and searching around and helping us financially, but most importantly with prayers.
How do you see the situation of Hispanic in the U.S., in the Catholic Church? In general,
that's a big question because
as
you know, right?
I know. Yeah,
right. As you know, it's like so. Here in the reality in the Archdiocese, we have, because of the meatpacking plants that are here and the agriculture that's here, we have a very long tradition of Latinos coming up here and working in the plants, working on farms. And so it's a well-established community here, and the ministry to them is going to be very basic. So in terms of just basic catechesis, helping regularize marriages, making sure families come and baptize their children, and for the most part, our efforts in that are really quite successful. One of the bigger problems, though, is because, as you were saying before, the experience of the American Catholic Church is different than it is in the church in Latin American countries. For many local Latinos, there's the idea of paying for school to go to a Catholic school is foreign. And so trying to get Latino families to send their children to our schools so they can get some of that formation in the church's living, breathing, right? Because it's not in the air. You're not going to find shrines to Our Lady on the side of the street here. That's one of the biggest challenges for us.
Okay, thank you.
I'm thinking here in Los Angeles, the church is Latino. And were it not for Latinos, there really wouldn't be a church here in Los Angeles. It's a very different set of conditions. And I think of our parishes, a number of our parishes will have 12 or 13 Spanish language liturgies on Sunday. And a number of our churches have 10, 12,000 registered families. And that's so unlike, say, the Midwest, Michigan, which you mentioned way back at the beginning of our discussion. So unlike what I experienced growing up in Michigan. You also have a connection, quite a connection, with the propagation of the faith. A word about that, perhaps.
Yeah, that's actually been one of the unexpected joys of working for the church. So a number of years ago, Archbishop Lucas asked me to take over the propagation of the faith. And for those who don't know what it is, it's actually a pontifical institute founded in the late 1800s to try to help raise funds for missionary works across the world. So I'm in charge of the mission cooperation plan, where we have missionary priests and sisters from other parts of the world come to Omaha and give a homily, sometimes celebrate Mass at a parish, and then collect the funds and send it with them. So I've been exposed to priests from Pakistan and various, 5, 6 different countries in Africa and Latin America and India and other places. And it's been a joy to hear from them what it's like to be Catholic in their part of the world, and what living the Church of Social Teaching means for them. So I have a good friend, a priest friend in Pakistan, a Muslim majority country. Christians make 1%, Catholics make 1% of the population, and there's a lot of discrimination against them. And so what does being church mean for them? It's radically different. So we do what we can to help them and help him and the ministry that they do, but it's been absolutely eye-opening. So in your diocese, wherever you're at, if you see World Mission Sunday, which is usually the 4th Sunday in October, or you have a visiting priest from Mission Co-op, please do support them because they're doing incredible work all over the world.
We've spoken a lot about challenges in this last hour and made references to the so-called real world. Although if we're not in the real world, I don't know where we'd be. And the challenges of everyday life, that expression, life happens. And you just made a comment about different cultures. Well, we're used to hearing what Confucius would say. We're used to hearing what Confucius would say, but back in the day when Confucius said something, people really didn't pay that much attention to him. And we forget that. But one day, Confucius looked around what was going on. Then he looked out at people and he said, "Listen up, people. If it's not one damn thing, it's another." And ever since then, people have been listening to Confucius. At the time, they said, this guy knows what he's talking about after all. Now, on that semi-historical and light note, we come to an end, but we come to an end with something that goes as deep as we could ever go and is decidedly historical, the incarnation and the gospel for today. You mentioned you'd been working with the Gospel of John. Today's gospel is from John. Lifting up his eyes to heaven, Jesus prayed, saying, "Holy Father, keep them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one, just as we are one. When I was with them, I protected them in your name that you gave me, and I guarded them, and none of them was lost except the son of destruction, in order that the scriptures might be fulfilled. But now I am coming to you. I speak this in the world, so that they may share my joy completely. I gave them your word, and the world hated them because they do not belong to the world any more than I belong to the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world any more than I belong to the world. Consecrate them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I sent them into the world, and I consecrate myself for them, so that they also may be consecrated in truth. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much, Deacon Omar.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you both.
Appreciate
Very
your
good
Thank
to
you.
be
experiences,
with you.
your insight, and your resolve.
Excellent.
Godspeed.
Keep up the good work, gentlemen.
See you around.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.